Picture a scene almost 1,000 years ago. A Viking longship, battered and weary, rides the crest of a monstrous Atlantic wave. Salt spray stings the eyes of the crew as they cling to the rails, their world a churning chaos of wind and water. For days they have been lost, driven far from any known course, and then, through the mist and driving rain, a cry rings out from the lookout land. An unknown coastline, rugged and forested, rises from the sea. It is a moment of sheer, unimaginable relief and triumph, a discovery that would echo through the sagas. Now, fast forward to a quiet library in the modern day. A historian carefully unrolls a brittle piece of parchment. On it, drawn in faint, brownish ink, is a map of the world, but this is no ordinary chart. In the upper left corner, across a vast ocean, lies a landmass labeled in medieval Latin Vinland. This single document, known as the Vinland Map, promises to be the first and only known cartographic evidence that Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus. It is a relic that could fundamentally rewrite the history of the New World. Yet, from the moment it surfaced, it has been engulfed in a firestorm of controversy, accused of being one of the most brilliant and audacious forgeries ever created. This is the heart of one of history's greatest and most enduring puzzles. It's a mystery that pits cutting-edge science against medieval craftsmanship, where the answers are hidden not in grand monuments, but in the very fibers of the parchment and the chemical composition of the ink itself. So, join us on a deep dive into a world of ancient secrets and modern suspicions. We're going to follow the evidence, sift through the claims and counterclaims, and investigate whether this map is a genuine 1,000-year-old secret finally revealed, or an elaborate hoax that has fooled experts for decades. This is a journey to the very edge of the known world and into the shadowy corners of historical deception. The truth is waiting. The story of the map's modern emergence is as shrouded in intrigue as its medieval origins. It wasn't discovered in a grand archaeological dig or a royal archive, but appeared quietly and unexpectedly in the world of rare books. In the year 1957, a prominent London bookseller named Irving Davis placed a discreet offer. He wasn't selling the map on its own. It was presented as a companion piece to a genuine, well-known medieval manuscript called the Tartar Relation. This was a clever move, as if to suggest the two documents had always belonged together, giving the mysterious map an instant air of ancient legitimacy. The physical object itself was both compelling and strangely flawed. It was drawn on a single sheet of parchment made from calfskin, and it showed its age. The material was brittle, covered in a pattern of tiny, tunnel-like holes known as wormholes that snaked across its surface, and the image it bore was deceptively simple. It showed the known world of the Middle Ages, Europe, Africa, and Asia, but then, in the upper left, the cartographer had drawn a vast, additional landmass across the Atlantic Ocean. It was labeled in stark Latin letters, Vinlandia Insula, the island of Vinland. The implications were staggering. Here, in plain ink on old parchment, was what appeared to be a medieval map that included part of North America. This wasn't just a mention in a saga. It was a visual representation, a chart that placed Viking discoveries firmly within the geographical understanding of the pre-Columbian world. For historians, it was as if a missing piece of the planetary puzzle had suddenly clicked into place. The academic community was electrified. For decades, the Norse sagas had spoken of Leif Erikson's voyage to a place he called Vinland, a land of wild grapes and forests. While these stories were compelling, they were just that, stories written down long after the events they described. The Vinland Map offered something far more concrete. It was tangible, physical proof that seemed to corroborate those ancient tales, suggesting that knowledge of the New World wasn't just preserved in Scandinavian oral traditions, but was actually mapped and integrated into the European worldview. It meant that Columbus, setting sail in 1492, might not have been venturing into a complete void, but was perhaps following whispers of a land that already existed on a few secret charts. The map was a bombshell that threatened to rewrite one of the most foundational narratives of history, shifting the credit for the European discovery of America from the Mediterranean south to the Scandinavian north. The potential for it to be genuine was so monumental that it was almost too thrilling to question. Unrolling the Vinland map is like opening a window to the medieval mind, a glimpse of how the world was understood before the great transatlantic voyages of the late 15th century. At its heart, the map is a portal and chart, a type of navigational map used by sailors, and it depicts the 3 known continents with a style that is both familiar and strangely distorted to the modern eye. Europe is drawn with its distinctive boot like Italy and the British Isles dangling off the coast. Africa sits to the south, though its shape is squashed and its southern extent is a mystery, blending into a vast, unknown ocean. To the right, Asia sprawls eastward, a massive landmass that includes the Caspian Sea and hints at the realms of the Far East. This part of the map is consistent with other European maps from the 1400s, reflecting the geographical knowledge and the many blind spots of the time. But it's when you let your gaze travel left across a vast and empty Atlantic Ocean that the map reveals its staggering secret. There, in the upper left corner, sits a large, roughly drawn island. It's depicted as a separate landmass, not connected to Asia, floating in the Western Sea, and written across it in a clear, medieval Latin hand are 2 words that have caused decades of debate: Vinlandia Insula, the island of Vinland. This alone would be explosive, but the map doesn't stop there. Just beside this mysterious island, the cartographer added a block of text, an inscription that serves as a direct bridge from this piece of parchment to the ancient Viking sagas. The text reads, in translation, discovered by Bjarni and Leif in company. This is a profoundly specific and revealing detail. It doesn't just name the land, it names the discoverers and presents them as a team. This directly echoes the 2 main Icelandic sagas, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. In those stories, the discovery unfolds as a sequence of events. The merchant Bjarni Herjolfsson is blown off course on his way to Greenland and is the first European to sight this unknown wooded coastline. Later, Leif Erikson, hearing Bjarni's description, buys his ship and retraces the route, making the first intentional landing and naming the country Vinland for the grapevines he found. The map's inscription fuses these 2 moments, crediting both men together for the discovery. This isn't a vague legend about a land to the west. It is a precise historical claim that aligns perfectly with the Norse literary record. For those who believe the map is genuine, this inscription is the linchpin of its authenticity. It shows a knowledge of the sagas so intimate and nuanced that a modern forger would have had to be an expert medieval scholar to get it right, decades before this level of saga scholarship was common. It presents a version of history that was largely forgotten by the rest of Europe, a secret held for centuries by the Norse. The visual impact of seeing this land, labeled and described, placed confidently on a world map is undeniable. It suggests that at least one anonymous cartographer working in an European scriptorium believed the Viking stories were not just entertaining tales, but true geographical reports worthy of being recorded for posterity. But this map, this incredible piece of parchment, did not appear in a vacuum. Its entire claim to legitimacy rests upon the foundation of 2 ancient stories, texts that have been passed down through the centuries like a cherished family secret. These are the Icelandic sagas specifically, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. For generations, these narratives existed in a strange historical limbo, part history and part legend, telling a tale so audacious that many scholars hesitated to take it at face value. They tell the story of the Viking expansion west of Greenland, a story that begins not with a heroic quest for discovery, but with a simple mistake, a navigational error that would change the course of history. Our first character in this drama is a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson. Around the year 986, Bjarni was sailing from Iceland to Greenland to join his father for the winter. It was a route he had likely sailed before, but on this particular voyage, his ship was beset by fierce northern gales and a dense, disorienting fog. For many days, his vessel was tossed about, completely lost in the featureless grey of the North Atlantic. When the weather finally cleared, Bjarni and his crew found themselves staring at an unknown coastline. It was not the icy, mountainous land of Greenland they expected. This new land was different. It was low, covered in dense forests with gently rolling hills. Bjarni was a practical man, a trader, not an explorer. He had not set out to find new worlds, and he was anxious to reach his father. So, despite the curiosity of his crew, he famously refused to land. He simply turned his ship around, sailed back out to sea, and eventually found his way to Greenland, bringing with him the first European eyewitness account of the North American continent, a story he would have told in the great halls during the long winter nights. This account, in turn, would have reached the ears of a far more ambitious man, Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, the founder of the Greenland settlement. Leif was intrigued. He was from a family of explorers, and where Bjarni saw a navigational hindrance, Leif saw an opportunity. The sagas tell us that he bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew of 35 men, and deliberately set out to retrace the merchant's accidental route. He succeeded, first coming to a barren, stone-covered land he called Helluland, or Slabland, which we now believe was Baffin Island. Sailing south, he found a wooded coast with white sandy beaches, which he named Markland, meaning forest land, likely part of modern-day Labrador. But it was his final landing that would become legendary. He found a place so temperate and rich that it seemed like a paradise. The salmon in the river were larger than any they had ever seen. The pastures were lush, and most importantly, they found wild grapevines laden with fruit. Leif named this place Vinland, the land of wine. He and his crew built sturdy houses and spent the winter there before returning to Greenland with a cargo of timber and grapes, treasures in a land with so few trees. For centuries, these sagas were the only evidence that any of this had ever happened. They were epic poems mixed with family histories, stories told and retold, written down on vellum long after the events they described. They were compelling, yes, but they lacked the hard, physical proof that modern historians crave. Were they accounts of real voyages or just heroic fiction, tales of a golden age meant to glorify the ancestors of the Icelanders who wrote them? The Vinland Map changed everything. It was the missing piece, the tangible object that seemed to reach across the centuries and say, this was real, they were here, and someone somewhere drew it all down. The map didn't just illustrate the sagas, it validated them, transforming them from semi-legendary tales into documented history. For decades, the Viking sagas were just that, sagas. They were magnificent stories, but they lived in the realm of literature, not proven history. Scholars could debate their authenticity endlessly in university halls, but without physical evidence, the tale of Leif Erikson's voyage remained a beautiful legend. All of that changed irrevocably in the summer of 1960 on a remote, windswept coastline of Newfoundland. It was there that a Norwegian explorer and his archaeologist wife, Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad, decided to test the old stories against the hard reality of the land itself. The Ingstads did something that few had done before. They took the geographical clues from the sagas seriously and combined them with a meticulous study of the North Atlantic coastline. They reasoned that if the Vikings had established a settlement, it would need certain things: a safe harbor for their ships, fresh water, and meadows for grazing their animals. They searched for years, following leads from Labrador to Nova Scotia, until a local fisherman in a tiny Newfoundland fishing village called Elance Ox Meadows pointed them toward some strange, overgrown mounds that people had long called the Old Indian Camp. What the Ingstads began to excavate there would stun the historical world. They didn't find a small, temporary campsite. they uncovered the unmistakable foundations of 8 Norse buildings, including 3 large multi-room longhouses built in the classic Viking style. The outlines in the earth were identical to those found in Greenland and Iceland. These were substantial structures with walls of turf stacked over a timber frame capable of housing up to 100 people. But it was the artifacts found within and around these buildings that erased all doubt. The team discovered a bronze cloak pin, a stone oil lamp, a whetstone for sharpening tools, and the kind of simple wooden spindles used for spinning yarn, everyday objects of Norse life. Then came the most conclusive evidence of all, the discovery of a smithy, a small workshop containing a simple stone anvil and a charcoal forge. Inside that forge, they found iron slag, the waste product from smelting bog iron. This was a technological signature that could not be faked. The indigenous peoples of the region at that time did not practice ironworking. This was a uniquely Norse activity, proving beyond any question that Europeans had not only landed here, but had lived here long enough to set up a permanent base and work the local resources. Radiocarbon dating of the organic material from the site placed its occupation at around the year 1000 AD, a perfect match for the saga timelines. Erlant's Ox Meadows was without question a Viking settlement. In that moment, the legend of Vinland crossed the threshold into verified history. The discovery sent shockwaves through the academic community. Suddenly, the sagas were no longer just epic poems. They were historical documents supported by hard, physical proof. This dramatic validation of the Norse presence in North America created a powerful new context for the Vinland Map. Before Erlant's Ox Meadows, the map was a solitary, almost unbelievable anomaly. It claimed something so radical that most historians were rightfully skeptical. But with the Ingstad's discovery, the map's central claim that the Vikings had reached North America was no longer just a claim, it was an established archaeological fact. The map was suddenly transformed from an outlandish fantasy into a potentially genuine medieval document that reflected a real, proven event. If the Norse had a settlement in Newfoundland, as the archaeology now proved, then why couldn't knowledge of that discovery have made its way back to Europe and onto a map? The existence of Erlant's Ox Meadows provided the map with a solid foundation of plausibility. It didn't prove the map was real, but it shifted the entire debate. The burden of proof was no longer on proving the Vikings had been to America, but on explaining how and if that knowledge had been recorded. The map now had a real, physical place to call home. With the discovery at Erlant's Ox Meadows transforming the Viking sagas into verified history, the stage was set for the Vinland Map to be recognized as a monumental piece of that puzzle. The map's new owner, Yale University, was determined to put it to the ultimate test. They assembled a dream team of the world's foremost experts, a group that included rare book connoisseurs, cartographic historians, and scientists from the prestigious British Museum. Their mission was straightforward but monumental: to subject this single piece of parchment to the most rigorous scrutiny available with 1960s technology. The initial findings were overwhelmingly positive. The parchment itself, made from calfskin, was examined and found to be consistent with medieval materials. It bore the marks of genuine age, including a distinctive pattern of wormholes that intriguingly matched the wormholes in the binding of the Tartar relation, the authentic medieval manuscript it had been sold with. This physical link was powerful circumstantial evidence, suggesting the two documents had been bound together for centuries, resting side by side in some forgotten library. Then came the analysis of the ink. Using a simple but effective microscope, researchers observed that the ink line had a cracked, fractured appearance, as if it had sunk into the aging parchment over hundreds of years. There was no visible halo of modern ink sitting on top of the fibers, which one might expect from a recent forgery. This visual inspection pointed toward a medieval origin. It seemed that every test was confirming what the historians at Yale desperately hoped was true. The evidence appeared to be lining up perfectly. The map's content was now backed by archaeology. Its parchment showed signs of genuine age, and its ink behaved like ancient ink. The combination felt too compelling to be a coincidence. The academic world was holding its breath, waiting for a verdict. That verdict came in a blaze of global publicity on October 9, 1965. Yale University held a triumphant press conference, a moment of pure, unadulterated scholarly triumph. They announced to an astonished world that the Vinland Map was authentic, a genuine 15th century document, and they were publishing a lavish book to prove it. The news exploded across front pages from New York to London. The public was captivated. Here was not just a story, but a physical object, a map that could be photographed and marveled at. It was presented as the smoking gun, the final, irrefutable proof that Leif Erikson and his crew had not only reached America, but that their discovery had been recorded for the European world. For a few glorious days, history textbooks seemed to become instantly obsolete. The narrative of Christopher Columbus as the sole discoverer of America was dramatically upstaged by a band of Norse explorers and a piece of yellowed parchment. The map was hailed as one of the greatest historical finds of the century, a priceless treasure that forever altered our understanding of the age of exploration. The celebration, however, was destined to be short-lived. Yet beneath the euphoria of that initial announcement, a current of skepticism began to stir almost immediately. Some of the world's top experts in medieval cartography looked at the map and felt a deep, instinctual unease. The geography, while impressive in its broad strokes, contained subtle errors and anachronisms, details that felt just a little too perfect, as if someone had carefully reconstructed a medieval world using modern sources. The loudest and most consequential doubts, however, would not come from the study of coastlines, but from the fundamental chemistry of the map itself. The turning point arrived in the early 1970s when a team of researchers, led by the renowned microscopic analyst Walter McCrone, was granted permission to take tiny, almost invisible samples of the map's ink. McCrone was a legend in his field, a scientist who had made a career out of forensically examining the smallest particles to solve big historical mysteries. His laboratory was his courtroom, and the witness was the ink. Using powerful microscopes and a technique called polarized light microscopy, McCrone and his team meticulously analyzed the samples. What they discovered sent a shockwave through the academic community that was even more powerful than Yale's original announcement. Embedded within the yellowish-brown ink lines, McCrone identified billions of tiny, perfect crystals of a mineral called anatase. This was a specific crystalline form of titanium dioxide. On its own, titanium is a common element, but this particular form, anatase, was the real problem. McCrone's analysis revealed that the anatase in the Vinland Map's ink was incredibly pure and consisted of particles so minuscule and uniformly round that they could only have been produced by a modern industrial process. This was not a naturally occurring mineral that a medieval scribe might have ground up and mixed into his ink pot. Natural anatase crystals are irregular and contaminated with other elements like iron. The anatase found on the map was a synthetic pigment, a product of 20th century chemical manufacturing that did not become commercially available until the 1920s. The implications were devastating. If the ink contained a chemical that didn't exist until the 1920s, then the map simply could not be from the 1400s. The ink, and therefore the map itself, had to be a modern creation. McCrone's conclusion was stark and uncompromising. The Vinland Map was a brilliant, sophisticated forgery. The forger, he suggested, had likely used a modern ink formula, perhaps even a common India ink, and then deliberately aged it to mimic the appearance of centuries-old iron gall ink. He had added this synthetic anatase, which is colorless, to give the ink a certain body and consistency. never realizing that this invisible additive would become the very thing that betrayed his deception decades later. For those who believed in the map, this was a catastrophic blow. The foundation of its authenticity, so carefully built upon historical context and archaeological support, now seemed to be crumbling under the cold, hard gaze of a microscope. Yet, just as the scientific evidence seemed to deliver a fatal verdict, a new and equally compelling line of defense emerged, one that turned the focus away from the chemistry of the ink and back to the physical object itself, the ancient parchment and its intimate, physical connection to a known, genuine medieval book. This is the story of the Tartar relation, a fascinating and authentic historical document that has been bound up with the Vinland Map's mystery from the very beginning. The Tartar relation is a manuscript from the mid-15th century, a first-hand account written by a Franciscan friar who accompanied a papal mission to the Mongol Empire. It is a real, undisputed piece of medieval history. When the Vinland Map first surfaced, it was presented alongside this very manuscript, and the physical evidence linking the two is astonishingly precise. Both the map and the Tartar relation are marred by a distinctive, meandering trail of tiny holes, the kind created by bookworms as they burrow through a bound volume over centuries. These aren't random patterns, they are like a unique fingerprint. When you place the map and the first page of the Tartar relation side by side, the wormholes match. They line up perfectly, creating a continuous tunnel from one document to the other. This is powerful, tangible proof that at some point in the distant past, the Vinland Map was physically bound within the same covers as the Tartar relation. They were literally part of the same book, resting together for hundreds of years, sharing the same environment and the same hungry insects. This connection creates an enormous problem for the forgery theory. Proponents of the map's authenticity argue that the wormhole evidence presents an almost insurmountable obstacle for any potential hoaxer. Think about what a forger would have had to accomplish. First, they would need to get their hands on a genuine, centuries-old medieval manuscript, one with a distinctive wormhole pattern. Then, they would have to carefully despine the book, separating its leaves. Next, they would have to find or create a blank piece of parchment of the exact same age and type, and somehow fake a wormhole pattern so perfectly that it would align seamlessly with the holes in the original manuscript. They would then need to draw the map on this carefully prepared parchment using their anachronistic ink, and finally, rebind the entire thing, hoping no one would notice the modern addition. It's a sequence of steps that requires not just artistic skill, but an incredible depth of knowledge about medieval bookbinding, access to rare materials, and a level of foresight that seems almost supernatural. How could a forger in the 1930s or 40s have been so confident that the microscopic structure of their ink would one day be tested, yet be so careless as to rely on such a complex and risky physical preparation of the parchment? The wormholes create a paradoxical situation where the physical object suggests a medieval origin, while the chemical composition of the ink screams modernity, leaving experts locked in a stalemate with two pieces of evidence that directly contradict each other. Just when the debate seemed hopelessly deadlocked between the damning chemistry of the ink and the compelling physical evidence of the wormholes, science delivered a bombshell from an entirely new direction. In the 1990s, with analytical techniques far more advanced than those available in the 60s, researchers were granted permission to perform a new, definitive test. This time, they weren't looking at the ink, they were going straight to the source, to the very skin of the animal that gave its life for this parchment centuries ago. They took a tiny, carefully excised sample from the blank edge of the map and subjected it to radiocarbon dating. This process measures the steady decay of a radioactive isotope of carbon, carbon-14, which all living organisms absorb from the atmosphere while they are alive. Once the organism dies, it stops absorbing carbon-14, and the existing amount begins to decay at a known, predictable rate. By measuring how much carbon-14 remains in a sample, scientists can calculate with remarkable accuracy how long ago that organism died. The entire academic world held its breath waiting for the results from the accelerator mass spectrometer, a machine that could count individual atoms of carbon. When the report came back, it was stunning. The parchment was dated to approximately 1434 AD, plus or minus 11 years. This placed the death of the calf squarely in the middle of the 15th century, a full 60 years before Columbus even set sail. This result was a game changer. It completely and irrevocably confirmed that the physical material of the Vinland map was undeniably medieval. For the map's supporters, this was a moment of vindication. It proved the parchment was not a modern fake. The calfskin was contemporary with the very era the map claimed to represent. It gave powerful new weight to the wormhole evidence, reinforcing the idea that this was a genuine medieval artifact that had been bound with the Tartar relation. Yet, for skeptics, this finding didn't close the case. It simply reframed the entire mystery. The radiocarbon date forced everyone to confront a new, more complex and intriguing possibility. The question was no longer, is this a complete forgery? It became, is this a modern drawing on a piece of genuinely old blank parchment? Imagine a scenario where a clever forger in the 1920s, 30s, or 40s gets their hands on a blank medieval parchment. Perhaps it was a leftover leaf from a disbound book or a discarded-in paper. To a forger, this would be the ultimate canvas. It already had the authentic look and feel of age, the correct texture, and perhaps even those all-important wormholes. All the forger would have to do is draw the map onto this ancient surface using their specially prepared, artificially aged ink. This theory, often called the forgery on ancient parchment hypothesis, elegantly explains the contradictory evidence. It accounts for the medieval date of the calfskin and the matching wormholes, while also explaining the presence of the modern, anatase-laden ink. It paints a picture of a supremely cunning and resourceful hoaxer, one who understood that the physical object itself needed to pass the most basic tests of antiquity. This individual wouldn't just be a skilled artist, they would need to be a master of historical research, with a deep understanding of the Vinland sagas and 15th century cartography to create such a convincing image. They would also need access to rare materials. A blank piece of medieval parchment is not something you can just buy at an art store. This new paradigm turned the Vinland map from a simple yes or no question into a multi-layered historical puzzle. The focus of the investigation now had to shift from the what and the when of the parchment to the who and the how of the potential forgery. Who in the 20th century had the knowledge, the motive, and the means to pull off such an audacious deception? As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the controversy surrounding the Vinland map refused to fade into history. Instead, it became a proving ground for ever more sophisticated scientific tools, each new analysis promising a final verdict. The debate over the ink, which had centered on Walter Macrone's discovery of anatase, entered a new, more precise phase. Researchers were no longer limited to looking at the shape of particles under a microscope. They could now probe the very molecular structure of the ink itself. One of the most powerful techniques brought to bear was Raman spectroscopy. This method works by shining a laser on a sample and measuring how the light scatters, creating a unique molecular fingerprint for any substance it encounters. When scientists trained this laser on the faint brown lines of the Vinland map, the results were unequivocal. The signature for anatase titanium dioxide appeared again and again. These newer studies, conducted in the 2000s and beyond, confirmed Macrone's core finding with even greater certainty. The anatase present was not just any titanium dioxide, but a highly pure synthetic form. The particles were not only the correct crystalline structure, but their size and uniformity were a perfect match for the commercial pigments produced in the 1920s and later. For skeptics, this was the final nail in the coffin. The most advanced science of the new millennium was upholding the conclusions from the old, reinforcing the idea that the ink was fundamentally modern. Yet, just as the scientific consensus seemed to be hardening, a fascinating and credible counter-argument emerged from an unexpected quarter, forcing everyone to reconsider a fundamental assumption. A small but vocal group of researchers and historians began to question whether the presence of anatase was truly a smoking gun. They pointed to a compelling possibility. Could this mineral have found its way into a medieval inkpot through entirely natural means? The argument hinges on the complex chemistry of historic iron gall ink, the standard writing fluid of the Middle Ages. This ink was made by reacting tannic acid, often from oak galls, with vitriol, which was a crude form of iron sulfate. This vitriol was not a pure, laboratory-grade chemical. It was a natural product mined from the earth or produced by roasting iron-rich minerals like pyrite. These raw mineral sources are frequently contaminated with a host of other metallic elements, including titanium. If a medieval ink maker had used a batch of vitriol that was rich in titanium impurities, and if that ink was then prepared or stored in a particular way, could tiny, pure crystals of anatase have formed naturally? Proponents of this theory point to studies that have indeed detected trace amounts of titanium in a few authentic medieval manuscripts, suggesting that the element was occasionally present as an unintended contaminant. The challenge, however, lies in the specific nature of the anatase on the Vinland Map. The crystals found there are not just any crystals, they are remarkably pure, uniform, and small. Critics of the natural contaminant theory argue that the geological processes that create anatase in nature simply do not produce such a refined, homogeneous product. Natural anatase is typically locked within other minerals, irregular in shape and chemically impure. To get from a lump of crude, titanium-contaminated vitriol to the billions of perfect, nano-sized anatase crystals found on the map would require a level of controlled chemical processing that was utterly impossible in the 15th century. This left the academic community in a deeply frustrating stalemate. On one side, you have the near-irrefutable data from Raman spectroscopy and electron microscopy, declaring the ink to be modern based on the anatase's purity. On the other, you have a logically sound, if unproven, historical argument that we cannot completely rule out a rare, natural occurrence. The debate was no longer just about chemistry, it was about the limits of our knowledge. How well do we truly understand the variability of medieval ink recipes? Could there be a lost, forgotten process that might explain this anomaly? This scientific impasse ensured that the map remained one of the world's most captivating enigmas, a puzzle where the pieces from different centuries simply refused to fit together neatly. So, if the scientific evidence remains locked in a stale while, perhaps the truth lies not in the chemistry, but in the drawing itself, in the lines, the labels, and the very shape of the lands depicted. When you shift your focus from the microscope to the artistry of the map, a whole new set of puzzles emerges, questions of style and geographic knowledge that some experts find deeply troubling. It's here, in the cartographic details, that the Vinland Map presents what might be its most fascinating contradictions. Let's start with one of the most striking features, the depiction of Greenland. On the Vinland Map, Greenland is drawn with a remarkable and, for the time, shocking accuracy. It's shown as a very large, long island with a deeply indented eastern coastline and a distinctive, tapered shape pointing north. This is geographically quite correct, but herein lies the problem. The consensus among historians is that medieval Europeans, including the Norse who settled there, did not know that Greenland was an island. They inhabited the fjords and farms on the southwestern coast. The harsh, icy interior and the vast, uncharted northern and eastern shores were a complete mystery to them. The idea that a 15th century European cartographer, presumably sitting in a monastery far from the Arctic, would have such a precise understanding of Greenland's full, insular form is historically jarring. It suggests a level of exploratory knowledge that simply didn't exist in the European geographical tradition at that time. In fact, no other known map from the 15th or even the 16th century shows Greenland as an island. Most portray it as a peninsula dangling off the northern edge of Europe, or as a vaguely drawn blob connected to Scandinavia or Asia. The Vinland Map's Greenland is in this regard centuries ahead of its time. This anachronism leads to a compelling and somewhat damning theory. The first reliable charting of Greenland's general outline as an island didn't occur until the 19th century, with serious exploration of its full coast. So, how could a medieval mapmaker have gotten it so right? Skeptics argue that the most logical explanation is that a modern forger, armed with 20th century atlas knowledge, simply drew the Greenland they knew from modern maps, inadvertently creating a glaring historical inaccuracy in their quest for authenticity. Now, let's contrast this with the map's portrayal of the European continent. Here, the precision is equally impressive, but in a way that creates a different kind of suspicion. The coastlines of the British Isles, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Mediterranean are rendered with a clarity and accuracy that is entirely consistent with the best Portolan charts of the mid-15th century. This part of the map is, without a doubt, expertly drawn and perfectly plausible for its supposed time, but this very accuracy creates a troubling juxtaposition. How can the same map that so confidently and correctly depicts Europe also contain a massive mythical island in the Western Atlantic that no other European map from the period even hints at? If the cartographer had access to such refined geographical knowledge for Europe, why is his depiction of Asia, a continent Europeans had much more contact with through trade and travel, relatively crude and schematic? And most importantly, why does the style of the European section feel so polished and professional, while the drawing of Vinland itself seems almost like an afterthought, a rough, simplistic outline that lacks the detailed coastlines and place names found elsewhere? This stylistic disconnect is hard to ignore. It's as if the map is a hybrid, a skilled copy of a genuine medieval chart for the Old World, onto which a speculative New World landmass has been awkwardly grafted. For a forger, this would have been the perfect strategy. Base the main body of the map on a real, historical source to ensure it passes initial expert scrutiny, and then add the controversial, valuable element Vinland as a unique selling point. This would explain why the European parts feel so authentic, while the inclusion of Greenland as an island and the entire concept of Vinland feel like interpolations from a different, much later era. The map, therefore, sits in a strange cartographic uncanny valley. It's neither completely wrong nor completely right in a way that feels organic. It's a blend of stunningly accurate pre-existing knowledge and inexplicably advanced, almost prophetic, geographical insights that together create a picture many historians find just too perfect to be true. While the debate over ink and geography rages, another battlefield has opened in the very words written upon the map. The Latin inscriptions are not just labels, they are a linguistic fingerprint, and some of the world's top Latinists and paleographers, experts in ancient handwriting, argue that this fingerprint contains some very modern smudges. The text is competently written, to be sure, but a closer word-by-word analysis reveals peculiarities that feel out of place in a genuine 15th century document. Let's start with the most famous phrase, the one that directly names the discoverers. It reads, "Abiano et Leifo sociais," which translates to, "by Bjarne and Leif in company." At first glance, this seems like a perfect, concise summary of the saga narrative, but linguists have zeroed in on the names. The Latinization of Leif as Leifo is highly unusual. It seems to be an attempt to render the Old Norse name into a Latin-sounding form, but it doesn't follow the standard conventions a medieval scribe would have likely used. More telling, however, is the rendering of Bjarni as Baiano. This spelling is a direct, almost phonetic transliteration from the modern Icelandic form of the name. A 15th century European scribe encountering this foreign name from a Norse saga would almost certainly have Latinized it differently, perhaps as Bjarni or Bernus, following the patterns they knew. The use of Bjarno suggests a forger working from a 20th century Icelandic text, simply adapting the spelling they saw directly into their Latin inscription. Then there's the grammatical structure of the phrase, a Bjarno et leipho sociais. The use of the preposition, a meaning by, in this context is grammatically awkward in medieval Latin. The phrasing feels stilted, as if someone was translating word for word from a modern language rather than thinking and writing naturally in the Latin of the period. A native Latin writer of the time would have likely used a simpler construction, perhaps the ablative case alone without the preposition, to express the same idea more fluidly. This points toward a critical possibility that the forger relied heavily on a modern translation of the Viking sagas, essentially back translating those modern words into what they believed was medieval Latin. They were constructing a sentence based on English or Icelandic sentence structure and then finding the Latin words to fit, rather than composing original thought in the language. This creates subtle but revealing anachronisms in the language patterns. The most compelling evidence for this theory comes from a specific and famous mistranslation found in one of the map's other inscriptions. Another block of text on the map refers to Bishop Eirik of Greenland setting out for Vinland. The Latin text describes the bishop as accompanying the Vikings. However, in the original Norse sagas, the story is quite different. The saga actually says that Bishop Eirik sent the Norsemen to Vinland. He did not go with them himself. This is a significant historical discrepancy. So, how could a medieval cartographer, supposedly working from genuine Norse sources, have made such a fundamental error? The answer, skeptics propose, lies in a specific modern book. In the early 20th century, a widely available English translation of the Norse sagas contained this exact mistranslation. It erroneously stated that the bishop joined or accompanied the expedition. If a forger was using this popular 20th century translation as their primary source, they would have faithfully copied the error directly onto their fake medieval map. This creates a devastating chain of logic. The map contains a historical inaccuracy that matches a known error in a modern book, strongly implying that the modern book was the forger's source material, not a lost medieval manuscript. For proponents of the map's authenticity, these linguistic arguments are frustratingly subjective. They counter that medieval Latin was not a monolithic, perfectly standardized language. Scribes across Europe had varying levels of education and used regional peculiarities. A strange spelling or an awkward grammatical construction could simply be the unique style of one individual writer, not proof of a hoax. They argue that it is arrogant to assume we know every possible variation of 15th century Latin, and that dismissing the map based on a few unconventional phrases is a step too far. Yet the cumulative weight of the linguistic evidence is difficult to dismiss. The strange name forms, the unidiomatic phrasing, and the precise replication of a modern mistranslation all point in one direction. They paint a portrait of a highly intelligent but ultimately tripped-up forger, someone with enough knowledge of history and cartography to create a visually convincing map, but whose linguistic skills were not quite deep enough to perfectly mimic the authentic voice of the Middle Ages. In their meticulous effort to get every detail right, they left behind a trail of words that, to a trained eye, whisper of a much later time. With so much scientific and linguistic evidence pointing toward forgery, we are inevitably drawn to the most human part of the mystery, the question of motive. If the Vinland Map is a fake, who would have gone to such extraordinary lengths to create it, and why? The answer lies in understanding the immense value, both financial and symbolic, that such an object would have possessed in the middle of the 20th century. Picture the post-war era, a time when the market for rare books and manuscripts was booming. fueled by wealthy collectors and institutions eager to bolster their prestige. A unique, previously unknown map that rewrote the history of the Americas would be the ultimate trophy, a piece that could command an astronomical price. While the exact amounts paid were shrouded in secrecy, we know the map changed hands through a chain of dealers, ultimately being purchased for Yale University with a generous donation. The potential payout for a successful forgery could have been a life-changing fortune, providing a powerful financial incentive for a skilled artisan or a desperate individual with the right knowledge. But money is rarely the only driver in such elaborate deceptions. The psychological and cultural motives run even deeper. The map emerged at a very specific historical moment, the 1950s, the dawn of the Cold War. This was an era defined by a fierce global competition for supremacy, not just in missiles and space, but in cultural and scientific achievement. For the Western world, proving the primacy of European discovery in the New World was a point of immense national and ideological pride. A map that definitively showed Norse presence centuries before Columbus resonated with a powerful narrative of Western exploration and ingenuity. It was a symbolic victory in a cultural Cold War, a way to assert a deeper, older claim to the hemisphere. So, who could have been the architect of such a scheme? The most compelling theories point to a forger who was not merely a talented artist, but a true scholar, someone with a deep understanding of medieval manuscripts, cartography, and the Norse sagas. This individual would have needed access to rare materials like blank medieval parchment, which could have been sourced from the in-papers of old books or from disbound volumes sold by European monasteries struggling in the aftermath of the World Wars. The technical skill required is breathtaking. They would have had to master the style of 15th century Latin script, understand the nuances of portolan chart design, and then carefully draw the map using a specially formulated ink designed to mimic the cracked, faded appearance of age. The addition of the synthetic anatase, perhaps to give the ink the right consistency, suggests a forger who was clever but not a chemist. They may have used a newly available commercial ink, unaware that its unique chemical signature would one day become its downfall. Speculation has swirled around several potential candidates. One intriguing figure is Father Fisher, a Jesuit scholar with a known interest in the Vikings and a reputation for both immense erudition and, in the eyes of some, a mischievous streak. Another is a shadowy Austrian art dealer known for his connections to the rare book world. There is even a theory involving a potential collaboration between a disgruntled scholar who provided the historical blueprint and a skilled calligrapher who executed the physical creation. The most tantalizing possibility is that the forgery was not born purely of greed, but also of a kind of intellectual vanity, a desire to create the ultimate historical artifact, to play a grand joke on the academic establishment, or to actively shape the narrative of history itself. Imagine the forger's satisfaction as they watched experts at the world's most prestigious institutions authenticate their creation, a testament to their own skill and knowledge. They would have proven that history is not just discovered but can be brilliantly, convincingly manufactured. This human element, the blend of financial need, scholarly pride, and a desire to leave a mark on the world, however deceptive, adds a deeply compelling layer to the mystery. It transforms the map from a simple object of study into a narrative of ambition, creativity, and audacious human cunning. Despite the formidable scientific and linguistic case against it, a dedicated group of scholars and researchers remains steadfast in their conviction that the Vinland Map is exactly what it purports to be, a genuine pre-Columbian artifact. Their arguments form a powerful counter-narrative, one that asks us to look beyond a single chemical compound and consider the full, complex tapestry of evidence. The foundation of their case rests on three powerful physical pillars that are incredibly difficult to explain away as part of a forgery. First and foremost is the radiocarbon dating. There is no disputing that the calfskin parchment dates to the 1430s. This isn't an estimate, it's a scientific fact confirmed by one of the most reliable dating methods available. This single finding transforms the entire conversation. It means we are not dealing with a modern object, we are holding a piece of the 15th century in our hands. The second pillar is the wormhole evidence. The precise alignment of the wormhole trails between the map and the Tartar relation is not a matter of opinion, it is a physical fact. These two documents were bound together, sharing a common life cycle for centuries. To argue for a forgery, one must then accept an incredibly convoluted scenario, that a 20th century hoaxer not only acquired a blank piece of perfectly dated medieval parchment, but also managed to find a specific, genuine medieval manuscript whose wormholes would align with it, and then executed the forgery on that specific piece of skin. The sheer logistical complexity of this, the need for such a perfect storm of rare materials and foresight, strikes proponents as being far more far-fetched than the simpler explanation that the map is simply authentic. The third pillar is the ink's visual behavior. Under magnification, the ink line shows the characteristic cracking and sinking into the parchment fibers that is typical of ancient iron gall ink. It does not sit on top of the surface like a modern application might. This suggests that the ink was applied to the parchment when it was still relatively new and pliable, and that the two have aged together over the subsequent centuries, a process that is notoriously difficult to fake convincingly. But what about the annotace? This is the central battleground, and here the pro-authenticity camp launches its most sophisticated scientific rebuttal. They argue that the presence of titanium dioxide in its annotace form is not the incontrovertible proof of modernity that it first appeared to be, led by researchers like Dr. René Larsen, a conservation scientist. They propose that the annotace could be a natural contaminant that formed in situ over centuries. The theory goes like this. Medieval iron gall ink was made from iron sulfate, known as vitriol, which was a crude, naturally mined product. This vitriol was frequently impure, containing trace amounts of other metals, including titanium. Over the centuries, as the ink slowly degraded and interacted with the collagen in the parchment, these titanium impurities could have slowly crystallized into the tiny particles of annotace that we see today. They point to studies that have detected trace titanium in other undisputed medieval manuscripts, proving the element was present in some historic writing materials. The crucial point they make is about the particle size. While Walter Macrone argued that the small, uniform particles were proof of modern manufacture, other scientists have countered that the grinding and processing methods available in the Middle Ages, using quartz mortars and pestles, could have produced particles of a similar small size. They question whether we can truly be certain that no natural process could create such crystals, suggesting that our understanding of medieval chemical processes and long-term material degradation is still incomplete. Beyond the chemistry, defenders of the map point to its intellectual content as evidence of its genesis. They argue that the map's unique geography, particularly its accurate depiction of Greenland as an island, is not an anachronism but a revelation. It suggests, they say, that the Norse possessed a far more sophisticated understanding of the North Atlantic than we have previously credited them with. After all, the Norse were not just settlers in Greenland. They were intrepid explorers and hunters who very well may have circumnavigated the island, learning its true shape through centuries of lived experience. This knowledge, they propose, could have been transmitted back to Europe through trade routes or via the church. Remember the map's reference to a bishop of Greenland, and recorded by a single, insightful cartographer. The map, in this view, is not a perfect chart but a scholarly compilation, a best attempt to incorporate rare Norse geographical knowledge into a standard European worldview. It is a snapshot of a lost thread of understanding, a secret that was perhaps recorded once and then lost to history when the Norse colonies in Greenland faded into extinction. The very strangeness of the map, its blend of conventional European cartography and startlingly accurate Norse insight, is precisely what makes it authentic. A forger, they argue, would have played it safe, making the map conform perfectly to known 15th century styles. Only a genuine medieval mind, grappling with new and partly understood information, would produce something as unique and idiosyncratic as the Vinland Map. This ongoing debate means that the map remains in a state of suspended judgment, a centuries-old question mark that continues to challenge our assumptions about history, science, and our ability to ever truly know the past. Here's a theory that attempts to split the difference in this great debate, a proposal so elegant it almost resolves the central contradiction. What if the Vinland Map is both genuine and a forgery, but not in the way we've assumed? This is the core of the Black Legend hypothesis. It suggests that the main body of the map, the depiction of Europe, Africa, and Asia, is a completely authentic 15th century document, a real medieval map. But the island of Vinland itself, along with its crucial labels, was added at a later date, a deliberate and politically motivated insertion onto a genuinely old piece of parchment. To understand why anyone would do this, we need to step back into the turbulent politics of 16th century Europe. Following Columbus's voyages, Spain rapidly built a vast and incredibly wealthy empire in the New World. This sudden rise to global supremacy created immense jealousy and resentment among its European rivals, particularly England and the Netherlands. These nations began to propagate what historians call the Black Legend or La Leyenda Negra. This was a powerful propaganda campaign designed to depict the Spanish Empire as uniquely cruel, tyrannical, and barbaric in its treatment of indigenous peoples. The goal was to undermine Spain's moral and legal claims to the Americas. If Spain could be portrayed as an illegitimate, brutal occupier, then other European powers could justify their own attempts to seize territory and challenge Spanish dominance. Now imagine a clever, anti-Spanish propagandist in, say, the mid-1600s getting their hands on a real but unremarkable 15th century world map. This person sees an opportunity. What if they could discover a document that proved beyond any doubt that the Vikings had reached North America long before Columbus ever set sail? Such a map would be a geopolitical bombshell. It would legally and historically invalidate Spain's prime claim of discovery. It would say to the world, the Spanish are not the discoverers, they are merely latecomers, usurpers who took lands that another European people had already found centuries earlier. This would be the ultimate weapon in the arsenal of the Black Legend. In this scenario, the forger isn't a 20th century con artist seeking money, but a 17th century partisan seeking to change the course of history through a perfectly timed deception. They would take the authentic old map and with a carefully prepared ink that mimicked the original, add the landmass of Vinland in the empty space of the Atlantic. They would write the inscriptions naming Bjarni and Leif, drawing directly from the Norse sagas which were still preserved in Scandinavian contexts. This theory brilliantly reconciles the warring pieces of evidence. It explains why the parchment and the wormholes are undeniably medieval because the base map is the real deal. It explains why the geography of Europe is so accurate. It was drawn by a skilled medieval cartographer. It even explains the anachronistic depiction of Greenland as an island. The forger, working a century or two later, might have had access to slightly better geographical knowledge than a 15th century monk. Most importantly, it provides a compelling explanation for the problematic ink. The anatase titanium compound might not be a 20th century mistake, but rather evidence of a 17th century ink recipe. The science of ink making evolved over time, and a forger working in the 16 or 1700s would have used materials available in their own era. Materials that would naturally be different from a pure 15th century iron gall ink. This would mean the ink isn't modern in the sense of being from the 1900s, but is still modern relative to the map's supposed date, creating the chemical anomaly that so confounds scientists today. The Black Legend hypothesis reframes the entire mystery. It transforms the map from a potential academic hoax into an object of geopolitical intrigue, a clandestine weapon in a Cold War between empires. It suggests the map's greatest secret isn't necessarily the location of Vinland, but the hidden hand of a propagandist who understood that controlling the past is the key to controlling the present. It's a theory that gives everyone something to consider. The map's defenders can point to the authentic medieval core, while the skeptics can point to the later, politically motivated addition. In this light, the Vinland Map becomes not a simple truth or a lie, but a palimpsest of history with one story written over another, both vying to be heard across the centuries. Yale University's journey with the Vinland Map reads like a dramatic saga of its own, a story of soaring academic triumph followed by decades of painful public reassessment. Imagine the atmosphere in that room on October 9, 1965. The university was not merely announcing an acquisition, it was staging a coronation. Flanked by distinguished scholars and the weight of their own extensive research, the message was one of absolute certainty. They presented the map to the world not as a probable artifact, but as a confirmed relic, a 15th century document that irrevocably changed history. The press release was a masterpiece of confidence, and the media spectacle that followed was immense. For Yale, this was a crowning achievement, a moment that placed the university at the very center of a global historical conversation. It was a public relations and academic coup of the highest order, a testament to their scholars' discernment and their institution's role as a guardian of priceless knowledge. The map was instantly enshrined as one of their most treasured possessions, a jewel intended to shine forever in their collection. Yet that unshakable confidence was the first thing to crumble. The initial cracks appeared with Walter Macrone's Annotace findings in the early 1970s. Suddenly, the university found itself in an incredibly difficult position. They had staked their immense reputation on the map's authenticity, and now a respected scientist was presenting forensic evidence that directly contradicted their official conclusion. The internal reaction was likely a mixture of disbelief, defensiveness, and deep concern. The map that had been a source of pride was rapidly becoming an intellectual liability. The following decades became a long, slow retreat from that triumphant 1965 position. With each new scientific analysis, the radiocarbon dating that confirmed the Parchment but complicated the narrative, the advanced Raman spectroscopy that repeatedly reaffirmed the presence of synthetic annotace, Yale's public statements grew more measured, more qualified, and far more cautious. The bold proclamations of certainty were replaced by the careful language of academic debate. They could no longer claim the map was definitively genuine, but they also could not dismiss it outright, not with the puzzling evidence of the medieval parchment and the matching wormholes. The university was caught in a bind, possessing an object that was simultaneously too credible to discard and too suspect to champion. This evolving stance culminated in a significant and telling moment in the year 2021. After the most comprehensive technological study to date, which again pointed strongly toward the ink's modernity, Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library officially shifted its description. They declared the map to be, in their view, a modern forgery. This was a profound and definitive reversal, a public acknowledgement that the cornerstone of their initial announcement had been flawed. It was an act of institutional humility, a concession to the overwhelming weight of the scientific evidence that had accumulated over half a century. Yet, even with this official position, the story doesn't end with the map being relegated to a basement as a mere curiosity. Today, the Vinland Map resides at the Beinecke Library, housed alongside some of the world's most genuine and priceless manuscripts. Its value has transformed. It is no longer valued primarily as a medieval navigational chart, but as a profound cultural artifact in its own right. It is a permanent monument to historical mystery, a testament to the enduring power of a great enigma. The library treats it as an object lesson in the complexities of authentication, a single piece of parchment that launched 1,000 scholarly arguments and continues to captivate the public imagination. Its presence in the collection is a recognition that historical truth is often a process, not a destination. The map's true legacy at Yale is not that it rewrote the history of exploration, but that it brilliantly illustrates the eternal struggle between different forms of evidence. The physical artifact versus its chemical composition, the historical narrative versus the forensic fact. It serves as a humbling reminder to all historians, curators, and scientists that our tools for understanding the past are always evolving, and that certainty is a fragile thing. The Vinland Map, whether a genuine secret or an elaborate fake, has ultimately taught us more about the nature of historical inquiry itself than it ever did about the coastlines of the New World. And so we arrive at the present day with the controversy still unresolved, the map resting in its case at Yale, a silent challenge to each new generation of researchers. But what if the tools to finally crack this case are now being forged in the digital fires of the 21st century? The next great chapter in the Vinland Map saga may not be written in a chemistry lab, but in the realm of ones and zeros, where modern digital forensics and artificial intelligence offer a completely new way of seeing. For decades, the analysis has focused on the chemical composition of the ink. The new frontier is the how, the very act of its creation. Imagine subjecting the map to high-resolution multispectral imaging. This technology goes far beyond what the human eye or a standard camera can see. It captures images at specific wavelengths of light, from ultraviolet to infrared, and can reveal layers of information hidden for centuries. With this technique, researchers could potentially peer beneath the surface of the ink lines. They might detect the ghost of a preliminary sketch, a guide drawn in charcoal or graphite that was then inked over, a common practice for medieval cartographers working on such an important piece. Conversely, the absence of such an underdrawing might be telling. More importantly, multispectral imaging can analyze the topography of the ink itself, creating a precise, three-dimensional map of every stroke. This is where the art of the scribe meets the science of the detective. A human hand applying ink with a quill pen in the 15th century creates a very specific physical signature. The pressure varies naturally, with a slight swell at the beginning of a stroke and a tapering end, and the line might show subtle shakiness or the unique rhythm of the scribe's muscle movements. A modern forger, using a different tool like a steel nib or even a fine brush, would impart a different physical signature onto the parchment. Their lines might be more uniform, their pressure consistently applied, or they might betray the slight tremor of someone consciously trying to mimic an old style rather than writing naturally. Advanced algorithms could analyze this topographical data, searching for the microscopic fingerprints of a 20th century hand at work on a 15th century surface. Then there is the power of artificial intelligence, specifically machine learning. To authenticate a document, paleographers' handwriting experts traditionally rely on their deep knowledge of scribble conventions, letter forms, and abbreviations from a specific time and place. It's a skill built over a lifetime of study. Now we can train an AI on that lifetime of study and much more. Imagine feeding an AI system a database containing digital scans of tens of thousands of authenticated manuscripts from the 14th and 15th centuries. The algorithm would learn, down to the most minuscule detail, what genuine medieval handwriting looks like. It would understand the common variations in the letter from a German scriptorium versus an Italian one. It would recognize the typical spacing between words, the slant of lines, and the flow of ink that characterizes real medieval script. Once trained, this AI could then be set upon the Vinland Map. It would analyze every character, every ligature, every comma and period. It would compare the map's script not just to a few known examples, but to the entire corpus of surviving medieval writing. It would be looking for anachronisms invisible to the human eye, a letter form that is statistically out of place for the purported date, a subtle curve in a capital V that only became common a century later, or a consistency in the hand that suggests a forger's conscious control rather than the natural variation of a scribe writing page after page. The AI would essentially be conducting the most comprehensive paleographic analysis ever attempted, free from human bias or the desire for a particular outcome. It could potentially even identify the specific region or even the monastic house where the scribe was trained if the hand is genuine. Or it could deliver a statistical probability that the writing is incompatible with the 15th century. This technological one-two punch imaging that reveals the physics of the pen stroke and AI that decodes the linguistics of the script could provide the corroborating evidence that has been so elusive. It might finally tip the scales if the digital forensics were to show pen pressure consistent with a quill and the AI found the script to be a perfect statistical match for mid-15th century work, then the annotace evidence would suddenly become a much greater mystery, forcing a radical reconsideration of medieval ink recipes. Conversely, if the imaging revealed tool marks unknown in the medieval period and the AI flagged a host of anachronistic letter forms, it would be the strongest possible evidence of a forgery, corroborating the chemical data with the very human act of writing. The promise of this technology is a final, data-driven verdict, one that looks not just at the ingredients but at the artist's hand itself. It offers a chance to solve a mystery that has defied solution for generations, proving once and for all whether this remarkable map is a medieval marvel or a modern masterpiece of deception. Far beyond the quiet halls of academia and the intense debates of scientific conferences, the Vinland Map has burst into the vibrant landscape of popular culture, becoming a modern icon for mystery itself. It has transcended its origins as a simple piece of parchment to become a powerful symbol, representing the romantic allure of ancient exploration and the thrilling possibility that our history books might be missing their most exciting chapters. Think of the classic adventure story formula. A dusty, forgotten artifact is discovered, promising to rewrite everything we thought we knew, but it is immediately shrouded in doubt and pursued by those who would suppress its truth. The Vinland Map fits this narrative perfectly, and storytellers from documentary filmmakers to novelists have eagerly seized upon its dramatic potential. In the world of non-fiction television, the map is a recurring star. Countless documentary series dedicated to ancient mysteries, historical conspiracies, and archaeological investigations have devoted entire episodes to dissecting its enigma. These programs often frame the story as a high-stakes detective drama. On one side, you have the heroic historians and scientists portrayed as intellectual sleuths using cutting-edge technology to uncover a suppressed past. On the other, a shadowy, implied establishment, or sometimes the specter of a brilliant, unknown forger, a villainous genius who nearly pulled off the perfect crime. The visual language is compelling close-ups of the map's faint lines, dramatic recreations of Viking longships battling Atlantic storms, and moody shots of scientists in labs, their faces lit by the glow of computer screens displaying chemical data. This treatment transforms complex scientific debates about anatase crystals and radiocarbon dating into a gripping, accessible human story of truth versus deception, a battle over the very ownership of history. This cultural footprint extends powerfully into the realm of fiction, where authors have woven the map into thrilling narratives that blend fact and speculation. In novels, the map is rarely just a background detail. It is often the central MacGuffin, the object that sets the entire plot in motion. It appears in crime thrillers where bibliophiles are murdered for its secret, in historical conspiracy novels where it proves the existence of a lost Norse colony in the American heartland, and in techno thrillers where modern-day adventurers race to find the real Vinland based on clues hidden within the map's contours. These stories tap directly into the public's fascination with alternate history. They explore tantalizing what-if scenarios. What if the Norse had established a permanent, thriving settlement? What if their knowledge of North America was widespread in medieval Europe, but was deliberately erased by the church or rival powers? The map becomes the tangible key to unlocking these possibilities, a catalyst for imagining a world where the colonization of the Americas began with Norse traders and farmers 500 years before the Spanish and English. This fictional treatment amplifies the map's mystique, cementing its image in the public mind not just as an academic curiosity, but as a potential gateway to a hidden past, a secret that powerful forces might have wanted to keep buried. It speaks to a deep-seated human desire to believe that history is not a closed book, but a living, contested space where new discoveries can still overturn our most fundamental beliefs. Ultimately, the enduring power of the Vinland Map in our collective imagination stems from its perfect embodiment of two equally potent cultural forces: the romance of the Viking Age and our modern appetite for conspiracy and skepticism. On one hand, the map is inextricably linked to the Vikings, a people who have been romanticized as the ultimate explorers, fearless, independent, and technologically advanced for their time. They represent a rugged, elemental form of adventure, sailing into the literal unknown based on little more than skill, courage, and a sense of destiny. The map connects us directly to that romance. It's not just a chart, it's a proxy for the long ship, the stormy sea, and the first sighting of a new world. It allows us to feel a connection to Leif Erikson and his crew, to imagine their awe and triumph captured in a drawing. Simultaneously, the map's controversy makes it a perfect symbol for our contemporary era of questioning authority and official narratives. In a world where we are increasingly aware of how history can be shaped by the victors, the map's disputed nature resonates deeply. It represents the idea that the official story of Columbus's discovery is incomplete or even wrong. It validates a suspicion that the past is messier and more interesting than what we were taught in school, and that institutions, even prestigious universities like Yale, can be fooled or can be reluctant to accept challenging truths. The map sits right at the intersection of these two powerful ideas. It is both a relic of a golden age of exploration we admire and a piece of evidence in an ongoing trial against conventional history. It doesn't matter if you are a scientist, a history buff, or simply someone who loves a good mystery, the Vinland Map offers something for everyone. It invites us all to become detectives, to look at a faded piece of parchment and decide for ourselves where the line between world-changing truth and brilliant deception truly lies. The story of the Vinland Map is far from unique in the grand, shadowy theater of historical deception. Across the centuries, other documents have emerged from obscurity, each promising to shatter our understanding of the past, and each, in its own way, revealing the timeless patterns of the clever forger's art. To fully appreciate the Vinland Map's predicament, it's illuminating to place it alongside other infamous disputed relics, like the Hitler diaries or the ancient donation of Constantine. These parallel mysteries show us that the methods of deception and the reasons we fall for them are remarkably consistent. The first common thread is the forger's masterful use of genuine materials to create a veneer of authenticity. Just as the Vinland Map is drawn on undeniably medieval parchment, the infamous Hitler diaries, which surfaced in 1983, were written in authentic-looking notebooks from the correct World War II era. The paper, the binding, and even the watermarks were all meticulously matched to the period. This creates an immediate, powerful first impression. When experts can verify that the physical object itself is old, the hurdle for believing the content written upon it becomes much lower. It's a psychological trick, a form of misdirection where the forger uses a true fact, the age of the canvas, to sell a massive lie, the painting itself. Similarly, a forger creating a fake medieval charter would often use a blank piece of genuine, period-appropriate vellum, knowing that its texture, thickness, and even its smell would disarm initial suspicion. This tactic forces skeptics into a defensive, more complicated position, having to argue that while the material is old, the inscription is new, a nuance that can be difficult to convey and easier for a forger's supporters to dismiss. Another powerful pattern is the exploitation of historical gaps and unanswered questions. Forgers are not just artists, they are sophisticated psychologists who understand what we, as a culture, long to know. They identify a tantalizing void in the historical record and then carefully craft an object designed to fill it perfectly. The Hitler diaries are a textbook example. For decades, historians and the public alike were obsessed with the inner workings of the Nazi regime, particularly the private thoughts of its fanatical leader. The final days in the bunker were shrouded in mystery. The diaries promised an intimate, day-by-day account straight from the source, a key to unlocking the mind of one of history's greatest monsters. The desire for that knowledge was so overwhelming that it clouded the judgment of experienced journalists and historians who were initially taken in. In a similar vein, the Vinland Map appeared just as the saga stories of Norse exploration were gaining public traction, but before the Elance Orcs Meadows discovery had provided concrete proof. It filled the gap between compelling legend and hard evidence. The most audacious example of this, however, is the donation of Constantine, a forgery that shaped European politics for centuries. This document, likely concocted in the 8th or 9th century, purported to be a 4th century decree from the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. In it, Constantine, grateful to Pope Sylvester I for miraculously curing him of leprosy, supposedly granted the Pope and his successors supremacy over all other bishops and, staggeringly, temporal dominion over Rome and the entire Western Roman Empire. For hundreds of years, this document was the bedrock of the Catholic Church's claim to political power in Italy. It filled a crucial void, providing a legal and historical justification for papal authority that was otherwise rooted in religious doctrine, not land deeds from a Roman emperor. It was a forgery created to solve a very real political problem, and it worked magnificently because it gave people exactly what they needed to believe. Ultimately, the engine that drives these deceptions is not just the forger's skill, but a profound and deeply human desire to believe. We are wired for narrative. We crave clear answers and world-changing discoveries. This emotional need can create a powerful cognitive bias, a willingness to overlook red flags in favor of a more exciting or comforting truth. The initial authentication of the Hitler diaries was rushed, fueled by a multi-million-dollar media bidding war and the sheer sensationalism of the find. Experts were pressured to provide quick verdicts, and the gravitational pull of the story was simply too strong. People wanted the diaries to be real because the revelations would be so monumental. The same psychological force was at work with the Vinland Map. For many, the idea that a band of Norse explorers beat Columbus to the New World is a more compelling, more democratic narrative than the story of a state-sponsored Genos admiral. It appeals to a sense of rugged individualism and accidental discovery. The map transformed Leif Erikson from a saga hero into a documented historical figure, and that was a story people were emotionally invested in believing. This desire can blind even the most brilliant minds. For nearly 700 years, the donation of Constantine was accepted as genuine, used by popes to assert their authority over emperors and kings. It wasn't until the 15th century that a scholar named Lorenzo Valla, using the then new tools of philology and textual criticism, systematically dismantled it. He analyzed the Latin in the document and proved it was not the style of the 4th century, but a later medieval Latin filled with anachronistic terms and grammatical errors. His work was a masterpiece of forensic linguistics, but it was only possible because he was willing to challenge a document that everyone had a powerful vested interest in maintaining as real. What these parallels teach us is that the market for forgeries is created as much by our own hopes as by the forger's cunning. The perfect historical deception requires a perfect cultural moment, a question burning in the public mind, and a deep, often unacknowledged, yearning for a specific answer. The Vinland Map, the Hitler diaries, and the donation of Constantine all arrived at their respective moments, offering seemingly perfect keys to unlock history's greatest doors, proving that the most successful lies are always the ones we are already wishing were true. Perhaps the deepest layer of this mystery is not about the map at all, but about why we are so irresistibly drawn to artifacts like this, caught in a tug of war between our desire for truth and our attraction to a beautifully crafted lie. At its core, the story of the Vinland Map functions as the ultimate intellectual detective story. It presents us with a puzzle where the clues are not fingerprints and alibis, but chemical compounds, wormholes, and faded Latin script. We are invited to become the sleuths, weighing evidence from a microscope against the testimony of a medieval parchment. This engagement is profoundly satisfying. It allows us to participate in history, to feel the thrill of the chase as we sift through the same data as the experts. It's a cerebral whodunit where the suspect is the past itself, and the mystery taps directly into our innate human curiosity to solve problems and uncover secrets. This is amplified by the sheer audacity of the potential deception. If the map is a forgery, we are not looking at a clumsy fake, but a work of immense sophistication. The forger would have needed the mind of a historian, the hand of a master calligrapher, and the cunning of a master criminal. This blurring of the line between creative genius and malicious deception is endlessly fascinating. We find ourselves in the strange position of almost admiring the skill involved, even as we condemn the act. It forces us to confront a troubling question. Can a work of such brilliant artifice, one that so perfectly mimics a lost piece of our heritage, hold a kind of perverse value of its own, separate from its truth? This fascination is rooted in a fundamental tension within our relationship with history. We crave a stable, documented past, a clear and truthful narrative about where we came from. Yet, we are also irresistibly drawn to the idea that this narrative might be wrong, that there are hidden chapters and forgotten truths waiting to be discovered. A successful forgery like the Vinland Map, if that is what it is, exploits this tension perfectly. It presents itself as that lost chapter, offering the thrilling possibility of overturning established dogma. It makes us question the authority of the history books and the institutions that guard them. In doing so, it empowers us, the audience, suggesting that the real story is not always the one written by the victors, but perhaps the one hidden in a forgotten library, waiting for a sharp-eyed detective to bring it to light. This is why the debate is so emotionally charged. It's not just about the age of some ink, but about who gets to control the story of human discovery. The map becomes a symbol of resistance against a monolithic historical narrative, and whether it is genuine or not, its very existence challenges us to be more critical, more questioning, and more engaged with the past. It holds up a mirror to our own perceptions, revealing that what we choose to believe is often guided as much by our hopes and our desire for a more exciting story as it is by cold, hard evidence. This juxtaposition is truly remarkable. On one hand, we have Elant's Ox Meadows, a place of profound and quiet certainty. It is a windswept, open archaeological site where the evidence was literally unearthed from the soil. There are no flashing lights or dramatic pronouncements here, just the steady, patient work of trowels and brushes revealing the foundations of longhouses and the residue of a smithy's fire. The evidence is physical, humble, and undeniable. A bronze cloak pin does not argue. A lump of iron slag does not care about controversy. These artifacts simply exist, silent witnesses to a truth that is now settled. Elant's Ox Meadows provides the unshakable foundation, the concrete proof that the Viking sagas were not mere fiction, but recordings of real human endeavor. It is the quiet, sturdy bedrock of this entire historical episode. In stark contrast, the Vinland Map is all noise and drama. It is an object of intense, unresolved debate, a parchment that has been scrutinized under the world's most powerful microscopes and debated in its most prestigious halls. Its story is one of chemical analysis, linguistic deconstruction, and constant public reassessment. Where the archaeology of Elance Orcs Meadows offers a calm, collective nod of agreement from the scientific community, the map provokes a cacophony of conflicting expert opinions. It exists in a state of perpetual uncertainty, a question mark drawn on calfskin. This creates a fascinating intellectual dynamic. The map, for all its controversy, has never been necessary to prove the central fact of Norse presence in North America. That case was closed conclusively by the Ingstad shovels and the carbon dating of seeds and wood from that Newfoundland site. The Vikings were here, they built houses, they worked iron, and they stayed for a time. This truth stands completely independent of the map's authenticity. So, if the map is not needed to prove the historical event, what is its real, enduring value? Perhaps its greatest contribution to history has been the immense, decades-long scrutiny it has provoked. In their fervent quest to either validate or debunk this single piece of parchment, scientists and historians have been forced to push their techniques to the absolute limit. The debate over the map acted as a powerful catalyst, accelerating the development of new forensic methods for analyzing ancient documents. Researchers had to ask deeper questions about medieval ink composition, about the natural contaminants that might be found in iron gall recipes, and about the long-term chemical changes that occur as parchment and ink age together. This intense focus ultimately shed light not just on the map itself, but on the entire field of manuscript studies. The arguments over its Latin inscriptions forced a more nuanced public understanding of the Viking sagas, bringing their complex narratives and characters into the mainstream conversation. In a very real sense, the map's controversy served as a global megaphone, amplifying the story of the Norse voyages far more effectively than a quiet archaeological report ever could. It forced everyone, academics and the public alike, to engage deeply with the evidence, to think critically about sources, and to appreciate the incredible journey of Leif Erikson and Bjarni Herjolfsson. The map, whether a genuine record or a brilliant fake, became the ultimate conversation starter, and that conversation repeatedly circled back to the solid, uncontested truth of Elance Orcs Meadows. Its legacy, therefore, is paradoxical. It may be a forgery, but in its role as a historical provocateur, it has inadvertently done more to cement the reality of the Viking discovery in the modern imagination than almost any other artifact. It forced the world to look more closely, and in doing so, it made the quiet certainty of those Newfoundland foundations ring out all the louder. To truly grasp the scale and complexity of this mystery, it helps to step back and trace the entire extraordinary timeline, a sequence that spans a full millennium of human history. Our story begins around the year 1000, in the age of Viking longships and oral sagas. This is the era when Norse explorers, first accidentally blown off course like the merchant Bjarni Herjolfsson, and then intentionally led by the ambitious Leif Erikson, made landfall on the North American coastline. They established a small settlement at a place we now call Elance Orcs Meadows in Newfoundland, a base for exploring a land they named Vinland. For a few short years, these Norse settlers lived and worked there, their story preserved not in stone monuments, but in the epic poems and family histories of the Icelandic sagas, tales passed down for generations before being written on vellum. Then, for centuries, their discovery faded from European memory, becoming little more than a half-forgotten legend while the world moved on, ultimately crediting Christopher Columbus with the discovery of the Americas in 1492. The Vinland narrative lay dormant, a seed waiting for the right conditions to sprout. The next major act in our timeline begins in the middle of the 20th century. In the year 1957, the Vinland Map dramatically and mysteriously resurfaces, not in a remote archaeological dig, but in the sophisticated world of European rare book dealers. A London bookseller offers it for sale, presenting it as a curious companion to a genuine 15th century manuscript known as the Tartar Relation. The map's appearance is a seismic event in the world of history, a seemingly medieval document that boldly depicts a landmass across the Atlantic labeled Vinland. Its potential implications are so staggering that it quickly captures attention of Yale University, which, after a period of secretive study, acquires the map. The university's investment culminates in a triumphant press conference on October 9, 1965, where they publicly announce the map's authenticity to a stunned world, declaring it a genuine pre-Columbian artifact that rewrites the history of exploration. For a few brief, glorious days, it seems the history books have been permanently altered. But this moment of academic triumph is almost immediately challenged by a parallel discovery happening in the field. Just a few years before Yale's announcement, in 1960, Norwegian explorers Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad began their own quest, using the sagas as a guide to search for physical proof of the Viking presence. Their work led them to the northern tip of Newfoundland, to a place called Elance Ox Meadows. There, between 1960 and 1968, their excavations uncovered the undeniable remains of a Norse settlement, the foundations of Viking longhouses, a smithy for working iron, and everyday artifacts like a bronze cloak pin. This was not a map or a story. This was hard, physical evidence, and radiocarbon dating confirmed the site was occupied around the year 1000. The discovery of Elance Ox Meadows was a monumental achievement that proved, once and for all, that the Vikings had indeed reached North America. It provided a rock-solid historical foundation for the saga tales, but it also created a new, more complicated context for the map. The map was no longer needed to prove the Vikings had been to America, but now had to prove that medieval Europe knew about it. This sets the stage for the next pivotal phase, the scientific wars of the 1970s. With the map now a celebrity artifact, skeptics demanded harder evidence than stylistic analysis. In the early 70s, microscopic analyst Walter McCrone was given access to tiny samples of the map's ink. Using polarized light microscopy, he made a discovery that would define the debate for decades to come. The ink contained billions of tiny, perfectly formed crystals of a synthetic pigment called anatase titanium dioxide, a substance he argued was not available before the 1920s. His conclusion, announced in 1974, was a direct refutation of Yale's victory lap. The Vinland Map, he declared, was a modern forgery. This single chemical finding launched a back-and-forth battle that would continue for the next 50 years, pitting the map's compelling physical history against the seemingly irrefutable data from the laboratory. As technology advanced, so did the investigation. The 1990s brought another powerful tool to bear: radiocarbon dating. In a crucial test, a small sample of the map's parchment was analyzed, yielding a stunning result. The calfskin itself was dated to approximately 1434 AD, plus or minus 11 years. This finding was a double-edged sword. It definitively proved that the physical material of the map was medieval, not a modern fake, giving a massive boost to its defenders. Yet for skeptics, it simply refined the theory of the forgery, suggesting a clever hoaxer had drawn a fake map on a genuinely old, blank piece of parchment. The battle lines were now more clearly drawn than ever. The 2000s and 2010s saw the application of even more sophisticated techniques, such as Raman spectroscopy, which repeatedly confirmed the presence of the synthetic anatase in the ink lines. Each new study seemed to reinforce the chemical evidence for a modern creation. Yet the stubborn facts of the medieval parchment and the perfectly matching wormholes with the Tartar relation ensured the case could never be fully closed. This brings us to the present day, where the saga remains actively unresolved. In 2021, after the most comprehensive battery of tests to date, Yale University officially reversed its 1965 position, publicly declaring the map a modern forgery based on the overwhelming weight of the chemical evidence. Yet, even with this institutional conclusion, the conversation is far from over. The map remains a prized, if controversial, possession of the Bainick Library, and a small but dedicated group of scholars continues to argue for its authenticity, proposing alternative theories for the annotace or questioning the interpretation of the data. The timeline of the Vinland Map is not a straight line with a clear ending. It is a spiral where each new generation of technology and scholarship re-examines the same fundamental evidence, offering new insights but never quite delivering a final, universally accepted verdict. It is a mystery that has persisted for nearly 70 years since its appearance, rooted in events that occurred 1,000 years ago, and it continues to challenge our understanding of history, science, and the enduring human fascination with a great unsolved puzzle. So, after all of this, after all the carbon dating and the chemical analysis and the passionate arguments from both sides, we are left staring at this single piece of parchment, confronting a set of enduring, almost maddening questions. If we lean toward the idea that this is an elaborate modern forgery, we are immediately faced with a logistical puzzle of staggering complexity. How on earth could a 20th century hoaxer have achieved that perfect lock and key alignment of wormholes with the Tartar relation? This isn't a matter of just poking a few holes in some old paper. It means the forger would have needed to first acquire a specific, genuine medieval manuscript, study its unique and meandering insect damage, and then somehow replicate that exact, chaotic, centuries-long pattern onto a separate piece of blank medieval parchment before ever putting ink to it. The precision required is almost unimaginable, suggesting a level of craftsmanship and foresight that borders on the supernatural. It forces us to envision a forger who was not just an artist, but a master bookbinder and a prophetic restorer. Someone who could think centuries ahead and orchestrate the aging process of two separate documents to create a single, unified history. Conversely, if we allow ourselves to believe the map is a genuine medieval creation, we slam headfirst into the unyielding wall of scientific data. How then do we explain the annotace? The presence of that specific, synthetic form of titanium dioxide remains the most formidable obstacle to authenticity. The argument that it could be a natural contaminant from impure vitriol is compelling on the surface, but the specific purity and uniformity of the crystals, as identified by Raman spectroscopy, continually points toward a 20th century industrial process. To accept the map as real, we must also accept that our entire understanding of medieval ink chemistry is fundamentally flawed, or that we happened upon the one and only medieval scribe who, by sheer chance, used a batch of raw materials that, through a process we cannot replicate, somehow crystallized into a substance identical to a modern synthetic pigment. This requires a leap of faith that is just as enormous as the one demanded by the forgery theory. We are left choosing between two equally extraordinary scenarios, a forger of almost impossible skill and resources, or a completely anomalous and inexplicable chemical event in the 15th century. This naturally leads us to the most human question of all, who? Who would have possessed not just the phenomenal skill, but the deep, scholarly knowledge and the specific motive to undertake such an audacious project? The forger, if they existed, was a true polymath, a historian with a nuanced understanding of the Norse sagas, a cartographer who could perfectly mimic the style of a 15th century Portolan chart, a Latinist capable of composing plausible medieval inscriptions, and a chemist or artist savvy enough to concoct an ink that would visually pass muster. This individual would also need to have access to the rare book trade, to source blank medieval parchment and a specific genuine manuscript to use as a physical anchor for their deception. The motive itself is a puzzle. Was it purely for immense financial gain, knowing that a document rewriting history would command a king's ransom from a wealthy collector or a prestigious institution? Or was it something more complex and intellectual vanity, a desire to play a grand prank on the academic establishment, or even a nationalist or ideological urge to cement the Norse narrative in the history books? The psychological profile of this potential individual is as fascinating as the map itself, a figure shrouded in as much mystery as the artifact they may have created. And after decades of intense, multidisciplinary study, this is the map's ultimate powerful statement. No single theory, no matter how elegant, can perfectly and comfortably explain every single aspect of its existence. The forgery theory elegantly explains the ink but struggles mightily with the physical history of the parchment and the wormholes. The authenticity theory champions the physical evidence but stumbles over the damning chemistry. The Black Legend hybrid theory offers a clever compromise but introduces its own complexities about ink recipes and the motives of a 17th century propagandist. Each explanation solves one set of problems while inadvertently creating another. The Vinland Map refuses to be categorized. It is a perpetual paradox, a historical object that exists in a state of quantum uncertainty, seeming to be both genuine and fake until the moment we try to pin it down with a definitive label. Its true legacy may not be in providing an answer, but in masterfully illustrating the limits of our own investigative powers and reminding us that the past guards its most captivating secrets with a tenacity that can defy even our most advanced modern tools. So, where does this leave us after decades of investigation, with evidence that seems to point in two completely different directions? Acting as a judge in this historical trial requires us to carefully weigh two compelling yet contradictory cases. On one side, the prosecution presents a powerful scientific argument centered on a single, stubborn fact: the ink. The discovery of synthetic anatase titanium dioxide within the ink line is for many the case-closing piece of evidence. This isn't a matter of ambiguous interpretation. It is a specific chemical fingerprint. Advanced analytical techniques like Raman spectroscopy have repeatedly identified this compound in a form that matches 20th century industrial pigments, not medieval raw materials. The prosecution argues that this single finding overwhelms all other considerations. A medieval scribe could not have used a substance that wouldn't be invented for another 500 years. Therefore, the map must be a modern creation, regardless of how old its canvas may be. This scientific verdict is clear, repeatable, and rooted in the unyielding laws of chemistry. Yet, the defense for the map's authenticity presents a counter-argument that is equally formidable, built not on chemistry, but on the powerful, tangible history of the physical object itself. The first and most dramatic exhibit for the defense is the radiocarbon date. The parchment is undeniably medieval, scientifically confirmed to originate from the 1430s. This isn't an estimate, it's a fact that places this calfskin squarely in the era the map claims to represent. The defense then presents its second, almost unassailable piece of evidence: the wormholes. The perfect lock and key alignment of these insect tunnels with the genuine Tartar relation manuscript is a historical record written not in ink but in physical damage. It proves beyond any reasonable doubt that these two documents were bound together, sharing a common life for centuries. The defense argues that the likelihood of a forger orchestrating this perfect physical union, finding the right blank parchment and the right manuscript with matching wormholes, strains credulity to the breaking point. It would require a level of foresight and logistical genius that seems almost superhuman. How could a hoaxer in the 1940s have possibly ensured that the wormholes they created or found would align so perfectly with a separate, centuries-old book? This leaves us with a profound and seemingly irreconcilable contradiction. We are faced with an object that is, by its very nature, a paradox. Its body, the parchment, is demonstrably medieval. But its voice, the ink that speaks its world-altering message, appears to be modern. This is the core of the enigma that has prevented a final verdict for over half a century. You cannot simply dismiss one set of evidence in favor of the other without creating a whole new set of unanswered questions. To accept the map as an outright forgery, you must construct an elaborate narrative of a near-mythical forger, a criminal mastermind with the scholarly knowledge of a medieval historian, the artistic skill of a master cartographer, and the logistical cunning to acquire and prepare rare materials with impossible precision. To accept the map as genuinely medieval, you must argue for a radical revision of our understanding of historical material science, proposing a one-in-a-million chemical anomaly that allowed a modern synthetic compound to form naturally centuries before its time. Both scenarios are extraordinary. Perhaps the true lesson of the Vinland Map is not that we need to pick a side, but that we need to sit with the discomfort of the mystery itself. It forces us to acknowledge the limits of our own methods. Science, for all its power, is sometimes confronted with historical artifacts that don't yield tidy answers. History, for all its reliance on documents, must sometimes admit that the physical evidence can tell a more complicated story than the written record. The map exists in a liminal space between these two worlds, a permanent question mark that challenges our desire for certainty. It reminds us that the past is not always a puzzle to be solved, but sometimes a conversation to be continued. The absence of a definitive answer is not a failure of scholarship, but a testament to the object's enduring power to fascinate, to provoke, and to humbly remind us that some secrets, even those drawn in plain sight on a piece of parchment, are guarded by the centuries themselves. And so, the Vinland Map remains a centuries-old enigma resting in its glass case, a quiet challenge to our certainty. Our journey through its story has taken us across stormy Viking seas and into the hushed halls of rare book libraries, from the hard, undeniable evidence of an archaeological dig in Newfoundland to the breathtaking precision of a modern chemistry lab. We have seen how a single piece of parchment can ignite a firestorm that pits the authority of institutions against the stubborn facts of forensic science, and how the romantic pull of a forgotten history can compete with the cold, hard data of a microscope. This isn't just a story about a map, it is a masterclass in how we understand the past itself, revealing that history is rarely a simple collection of settled facts. It is a living, breathing, and often contentious conversation, a continuous debate between the stories we tell, the objects we unearth, and the science that scrutinizes them both. The map's true power lies not in providing a clear answer, but in its relentless ability to generate profound questions, forcing each new generation to look closer, to question deeper, and to appreciate the beautiful complexity of our shared human story. It stands as a permanent monument to the idea that the past is not a closed book but an open investigation. This conversation, however, does not end here. We have spent this time deep in the details of ink and parchment, but now we want to turn the investigation over to you. After considering all the evidence, the compelling scientific data, and the equally compelling physical history, where you land in this great historical debate? Do you see the hand of a brilliant 20th century forger, a criminal genius who nearly pulled off the perfect crime against history? Or do you believe this is a genuine medieval secret, a lone surviving whisper from a time when Norse discoveries were faintly recorded on the edge of the known world? Perhaps you're drawn to a more complex theory, like the Black Legend hypothesis, seeing the map as a hybrid, a real artifact weaponized by geopolitical rivals. Share your verdict and your reasoning in the comments below. We are genuinely fascinated to hear which side of history you stand on, and let this single, mysterious map serve as a spark for a much wider curiosity. If an object as studied as the Vinland Map can still hold its secret so tightly, what other incredible truths or magnificent deceptions might still be waiting in the dusty corners of the world? What lost charts, forgotten journals, or cryptic artifacts from the age of exploration are still tucked away in an attic, a monastery archive, or a museum basement, just waiting for a sharp eye to discover them? The quest for knowledge is never truly over. The next great historical mystery, the one that will once again rewrite our textbooks and capture our collective imagination, is out there. It's